Hello, my name is Nina. Welcome to my channel, Inside the Mind of a Human Predator. In this video, I wanted to do something a little different and introduce a new subcategory, something that will hopefully turn into a series on this channel, combining some of my interests. The first interest is true crime. The second interest is relevant to this channel, mental health and personality, as these subjects pertain to maladaptive individuals with long-term pervasive, harmful patterns of behavior, particularly in their interpersonal relationships. And the third interest is my ability to translate from the Russian language. Being Russian myself, my understanding of my home country, culture, traditions, current political climate, etc., etc. I think all of these are quite important. So I will be looking at true crime coming from Russia from the standpoint of mental health and personality. So obviously I will look at the facts first, but I will not only look at the facts, and the mental health personality aspects are going to be quite important to what will hopefully be a series on this channel. So the first case that I'm going to look at is a highly acclaimed case that is currently on trial, and that is the patricide by the three Khachaturyan sisters. Now, the way I will look at this case, format-wise, I will first look at the facts, and I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. And this is not a whodunit case. It was pretty obvious that the three teenage sisters have killed their father. The prosecution argues this was murder. The defense argues this was self-defense. So we'll look at this into this subject a little later. And then I'll look at where the case stands now, how the investigation was conducted, and my focal point will be the mental health and personality of A, the victim, the father, and B, the three girls. And to a lesser extent, I will also look at the girls' mother and their brother. Now, I'm not a mental health professional. As you know, I always give this disclaimer on the channel, but in this particular case, there is an absolute plethora of evidence regarding the mental health and personality of the subjects that I've mentioned. There are multiple reports about the father who was killed, coming from a mental health institution into which he had checked in, supposedly himself, on a number of occasions. So these were diagnoses of a real living individual. There are multiple posthumous assessments by the defense side and the prosecution side of the victim, and there are also psychological evaluations of the girls who committed the crime, but of course the way this crime should be qualified is what's been and is still being debated. So I'm not just making assumptions here. I can literally quote from the translated information that has been published in the public domain when it comes to this case. And it's pretty horrifying and fascinating at the same time, which is of course why it's been highly acclaimed. So first, let's look at the facts. On July 27th of 2018, a body of a man in his 50s was found in the hallway between apartments in an apartment building in Moscow. The body was riddled with stab wounds. There are conflicting reports, anywhere between 36 to 45 and up, but they all conclude that there were dozens. One of them was fatal through the heart, and predominantly a knife was used in the attack. An ambulance and the police had arrived at this apartment building in Moscow, and in fact they were called by the man's three daughters. At the time, the youngest, Maria, was 17, the middle sister, Angelina, was 18, and the oldest sister, Christina, was 19. So they're kind of back-to-back teenage sisters. The girls themselves displayed what at first appeared to be signs of an attack, being stabbed, and they were detained by the investigators, and literally within 24 hours during the course of information gathering and the interrogation of the girls, they had confessed to staging the latter part of the attack. What's been reported is that the youngest sister, Maria, had actually done this to her sisters in an attempt to conceal what had happened to their father, that they had actually killed him in this manner. So the whodunit is absent from this case. It was obvious that the three sisters have committed the crime. So what has been debated since is how to qualify the crime, whether the charges that were presented to the girls and the trials that have just started and will start because they're being tried separately, whether that should have been requalified as to their mental state, and of course the motive. So now let's have a look at what the girls state happened earlier that day. Their father had come back from a mental institution into which he had checked supposedly himself in and where he had been previously, and he became enraged when he saw that the apartment wasn't as clean as he had hoped, and also that the girls, according to him, had overspent by using his bank card. So he engaged in what he called parenting and what some would call torture. He would call the girls into his room one by one. He would denigrate them, and he would pepper spray them in the face in the context of this denigration and interrogation, which he called parenting. One of the girls, the oldest sister, Christina, had a severe asthma attack, and she actually fainted during the course of this torture routine. And later, medical examiners have confirmed that she indeed does suffer from asthma. So you can imagine that it's not just a certain type of physical abuse, but the health effects on someone who has this condition can be quite serious. So a number of hours had passed, and this is the reason why there is all this debate as to whether the case should be qualified as self-defense or premeditated murder. The father was resting. Some claim that he was completely asleep. The defense claims that he was resting in between the abuse and torture of the girls in which he engaged earlier in the day. The girls had attacked, all three girls had attacked him in the state with a knife and began stabbing him. If you look at their photos, they're slender, dainty teenage girls, and he was a large man. Some of the reports say that he weighed somewhere between 120 kilograms, so that is 250, 260 pounds. So he was significantly larger and stronger than the girls. And he attempted to defend himself, and this altercation moved into the hallway between the apartments in this apartment building. Why the neighbors didn't react is, of course, one of the questions that had been raised regarding the entire situation of the girls being abused over the years. Some have said that the neighbors were so used to the screaming coming from the apartment that they simply ignored it. And in the context of this attack on the father, the youngest, Maria, is said to have grabbed the knife from her two older sisters, and she is the one that dealt multiple blows, including the fatal blow that went through the heart. Then the girls staged what was supposed to look like maybe a home invasion, call the ambulance, call the police, and the real the way the real situation unfolded became pretty clear within literally 24 hours of the crime being committed. So what happens next? Next, the girls were charged according to Article 105 of the Russian Criminal Code. Article 105 essentially covers various types of homicide, and the two older sisters, Angelina and Christina, were charged with what I would describe one of the harsher subcategories of that article, and that is a premeditated murder in the context of a conspiracy by a group of people. The sentence, if they are to be convicted according to this article of the Criminal Code, ranges anywhere between 8 to 20 years in prison, which is of course why there had been an outcry, not just from activists, but from various legal experts, that in the context of documented abuse, the subject into which I'll get into momentarily, they argued pretty convincingly that the girl should have instead been charged according to Article 108 of the Criminal Code, and that would have been more about manslaughter in the context of excessive self-defense. So the two older sisters are facing the trial, which is about to begin in Moscow on August 31st of this year, 2020. And it's a jury trial. However, the jury does have the option, if they are to be convicted, to give them a sentence that is lower than the 8-year minimum. And of course, they can completely acquit the girls. Now, the youngest sister, Maria, in the context of the mental health evaluation, in the context of the criminal investigation, she was deemed to not be mentally sound at the time of committing the crime. So she is being tried separately behind closed doors. That trial had already started in Moscow at the beginning of August of this year, 2020. And it's likely that she will receive mental health treatment instead of some kind of a prison sentence. And according to the reports, she was the one that was not yet, as horrible as that sounds, being abused by her father. So where was the mother at the time of the crime, and where was the girl's older brother, Sergei? Well, that is another separate, horrible and interesting aspect of the story. The mother and the brother were both kicked out and threatened with death and with a firearm, essentially. The mother says it happened in 2015, and she was forbidden to communicate with the girls. Some have really criticized her and in fact insisted that she should be charged with some kind of neglect of her own daughters. Having seen her media appearances, she really came across as a just destroyed, defeated person who, having been removed forcibly from the situation, did not appear to have sought proper mental health, having faced probably 2 decades of abuse from this man. And her whole story with him is also quite murky. In fact, we're not even sure if she's the wife or the common law wife, and I'll get into this later and I'll explain why this is relevant in the Russian context. But her story is so murky that there's a lot of kind of he said, she said type of information coming from sensationalist talk shows, which I don't even want to get into, regarding the paternity of the first child, the girl's older brother, who was also removed from the house and physically abused by the father, who had also suffered at his hands. And some have alleged that when she got together with Mikhail, the father. Aurelia is her name, the mother, was underage. She herself said that she had the first child at the age of the son, at the age of 19, and she's from Moldova, which is a former Soviet republic. Currently, it's an independent state, and whether or not she was underage is debatable, but we can convincingly state that in the very least she was very young, and she's made statements regarding being abused essentially from the time of the first pregnancy. So we'll get into her story at the end of the mental health analysis section, but this is why the mother was absent, as was the brother. So what came out during the course of the investigation is an absolute plethora of information about the abuse, mental, physical, and worst of all, sexual abuse of the girls. And the evidence is overwhelming regarding the behavior of Mikhail in other contexts, where he would display disproportionate anger toward, let's say, small business owners in his neighborhood, neighbors themselves. Supposedly, again, this is media reports, not necessarily corroborated. Police reports had been filed in those cases against him, and nothing was really done. The police seems to deny that, so it's unclear which one is true. Now, the girls' teachers supposedly followed up with, I guess, the Russian equivalent of CPS, Child Protective Services, and that hasn't been followed up upon. However, the girls themselves say that the teachers didn't really engage with them and sort of follow up on their plight. And the only person who did from their school was the school counselor, the psychologist, that she actually did try to help them and engage with them and counsel them and so on and so forth. So there's kind of this level of unclarity between various types of authorities that should have been involved in this case, and as it's unclear as to whether they were and the extent to which they were or were not, and the reasons for it as well. So nonetheless, there is all this information coming from uninterested, sort of objective sources, like the small business owners in the neighborhood that did not know the family personally, but could corroborate the aggressive, disproportionately angry behavior of Mikhail Khachaturyan whenever he interpreted the most minor things as a sign of disobedience, where he would threaten people with violence or even death, according to some of these media reports. In addition, there are recordings made by the girls themselves in which the father is denigrating them. I believe the one I heard, he calls them sluts and sort of denigrates them in this weird moral context, which is, of course, what makes it even more disturbing because the girls were sexually abused by him, not just physically abused. There are text messages between the girls and their friends over the years that also corroborated a lot of this abuse. What the girls had stated is that the father had a bell, and so whenever he wanted something, anything, from bring me a cup of tea to things that are much worse, he would ring the bell, and they were like his servants. The girls themselves called them themselves slaves, as his being akin to slavery, essentially. And the girls, supposedly, according to some of the reports, were essentially kept indoors for the last year of their father's life, which again raises questions as to what happened in the school system. Usually children graduate kind of around the same age as in North America, 17, 18, depending on when they start school. So if the youngest, Maria, was 17 at the time of the crime being committed, then she would have been 16 when that particular part of the ordeal started, and she should have been in school. So it's unclear why that very obvious abuse of power by the father was not investigated by the Russian equivalent of CPS. On top of that, there are multiple mental health evaluations and diagnoses. So first, as I've mentioned, coming from the mental health institution into which the father had checked himself in on a number of occasions. There are multiple mental health evaluations of the girls by the defense side, by the prosecutorial side. There is obviously the posthumous assessment of the girl's father as well. So the information regarding this particular subject is plentiful, and there's still not a lot of actually disagreement about that mental health component. Everyone, including the police investigators and the prosecutors, agree and acknowledge that there was significant abuse of many different types, including the worst type that I've mentioned in this case. And what is being debated is the level of premeditation. So some have made the argument that the girls may have had a financial motive, wanting the father's vehicles, apartment. Supposedly he was fairly well off. However, in the context of media coverage, the girls have rejected publicly the inheritance that they would have received from their father, which in my opinion kind of negates that whole idea. But of course, the youngest sister's trial is taking place behind closed doors. We don't really know what's being said, and the two older sisters' trial has yet to start, so we don't know what will be argued regarding the motive either. Now let's get into what I consider to be the most interesting aspect of this case, and that is mental health and personality. So I'll be looking at my notes a lot as I read out the quotations. So the first interesting aspect coming from the mental health institution into which Mikhail Khachaturyan, the father, had checked himself in, supposedly, on a number of occasions, is multiple reports coming from the medical staff regarding his disproportionate aggression toward other patients and medical professionals in that facility. Now, let's look at the posthumous mental health assessment by the Serbsky Center, which is a very well-known, highly acclaimed Russian institution, which is linked to the Russian Ministry of Health. So let's read out some quotes. He was found to be egocentric. He was found to have severe distrust. I would translate that as paranoia. He was found to be highly authoritarian, very manipulative. He was found to be constantly engaging in the twisting of information or lying in order to achieve his particular goals at the time. All of these are pervasive patterns of maladaptive behavior. He was very image conscious and very concerned about displaying his social status, and according to the Serbsky report, he did so in a number of ways, either through threats, insinuations about his connections to the criminal world, to certain levels of government, to law enforcement, and so on and so forth, or when it suited him, he would do so through displaying or claiming to be able to carry out certain favors by having these supposed connections to the highest levels of government and or insinuated the criminal world. I would add to this list his engagement in the Armenian Apostolic Church. His faith, as sort of his side of the family has stated, was very important to him, and he certainly displayed this. I believe, I'm not certain, he also engaged in philanthropy. In some photographs, he is seen to be wearing clerical robes, although the Armenian Apostolic Church had confirmed that he had no clerical status. So again, this goes to show a certain false image-making situation in which he engaged over the long term. And of course, he twisted certain aspects of Christianity to sort of push his argument for the type of domination and essentially tyrannical behavior in which he engaged in his closest family circle. I think the church aspect is fascinating because it speaks to a certain level of communal narcissism, if in fact he did engage in philanthropy. And those who only knew him in the church were shocked by what was coming out in the context of the investigation. So that tells me that he was pretty capable, in fact, of controlling his temper and his mood swings when it suited him. So let's move on. He was, let me quote, assessed posthumously to have, quote, personality pathology. He was also assessed to have, quote, somatoneurological pathology. He was assessed to have, quote, strongly expressed desire to dominate, end quote, his wife, his common law wife, his daughters, and so on and so forth. He was said to have used verbal denigration, physical aggression, including various types of weapons, physical and sexual abuse of the daughters, excluding the youngest daughter on the latter front. There were, as a side note, multiple injuries that were found on the girl's scars and the girl's mother. So they do allege that these were the result of the father using various weapons in the context of his abuse. The police did remove multiple weapons and firearms from the apartment. The list included knives, hammers, a crossbow, a rifle, a traumatic pistol, which is a non-lethal pistol in the Russian context, but it can cause a lot of damage. Also, Russian gun laws are much harsher than, let's say, gun laws in the United States. So the fact that he had this full collection is pretty interesting, although I didn't see things like handguns. The hunting rifle was easier to get, but nonetheless, he had this whole arsenal, including a crossbow, which apparently, if the girls and their mother are to be believed, and it seems like a lot of this other stuff was corroborated, including by the prosecutorial side, he used them for essentially abuse and what I would qualify as torture. He was also described, evaluated posthumously by the Serbsky Center to have they qualify it as, quote, mixed personality disorder. Now, there is no such qualification in the current version of DSM in North America, in the United States. So let me read out from my other notes, the Russian definition of what that is. And they describe it as, this is coming from the Russian Ministry of Health, mixed personality disorders basically translates into the fact that there are signs of several disorders, but without the predominance of symptoms, which would allow a more specific diagnosis. So in my layperson understanding, it's not like a comorbidity of, let's say, 2 cluster B disorders, for instance, but the maladaptive traits could be linked with multiple disorders, but there's not a sufficient number of them to make a more specific diagnosis. He was also on medication. The mother said he was taking it for his sleep issues. The medication was from, supposedly, benzodiazepines class, which is a pretty serious medication that someone would take for, let's say, anxiety. So there was also that aspect. And as a side note, that's actually pretty interesting in terms of the defense argument against premeditation. The fact that he was taking serious amounts of medication, the defense, I believe, is going to argue, from media reports at least, that the girls could have murdered him had that been the plan, in a much more subtle way, like giving him an overdose, which would have been a lot easier to explain in the context of his multiple visits and institutionalization in this mental health facility, to which he visited actually the day of being killed, than attacking him with a knife, which shows a stronger emotional component. So these are some other traits from the same analysis, posthumous assessment, not a diagnosis, because they did not see him as a living person. He was described to have, quote, inconsistency in behavior and expression of emotions. I read this as having severe mood swings. He was very conflict-oriented. He had, quote, a tendency to actively manifest acute aggression, including in unprovoked neutral situations. So this is what the small business owners in the neighborhood reported, where any challenge to what he saw as his dominance, anything that would come across as disobedience, in his view, was met with aggression and a lack of emotional control, threats of violence, and even death. And another very important point from the report, he had low levels of empathy. This is also a quote. Now, having examined the Serbsky Center's posthumous assessment of the father, Mikhail Khachaturyan, let's read out some traits of the narcissistic personality disorder. I'm looking at the Mayo Clinic website. An exaggerated sense of self-importance, having a sense of entitlement, and requiring constant excessive admiration. Being preoccupied with fantasies about success, power, brilliance, etc., etc. So just off the top of the list, we could see how Mikhail's image making in his church, his constant claims about having connections to certain levels of government, law enforcement, possibly the criminal circles, play into this. His sense of importance and his reaction to what he perceived as disobedience, as described by witnesses, also comes into play here. Let's read some more signs. Believing they are superior and can only associate with equally special people. This is another link to his image making, and it's unclear to what extent the image was real. We know he was not a cleric, even though he would wear clerical robes in certain photographs, as we've said. So it's safe to assume that he probably didn't have connections to the highest levels of government as he claimed to have. Taking advantage of others to get what they want. Is expecting special favors and unquestioning compliance with their expectations. Have an inability or unwillingness to recognize the needs and feelings of others. So this is the low levels of empathy described in the Serbsky posthumous assessment. Behaving in an arrogant or haughty manner, coming across as conceited, boastful, and pretentious. Again, this is something that was mentioned, arrogance, in the mental health assessments that I have brought up. Becoming impatient or angry when they do not receive special treatment. We've seen multiple reports from family, neighbors, small business owners, etc. Reacting with rage or contempt and trying to belittle the other person to make themselves appear superior. Having difficulty regulating emotions and behavior. We also see this in the Serbsky report. Now let's look at the same website, the Mayo Clinic, and let's read out related symptoms from the same cluster B category of the antisocial personality disorder, which is linked to a condition known as psychopathy. Disregard for right or wrong. So the fact that it's been impossible to determine whether Mikhail actually had any legal employment despite the appearance of wealth may lead to a conclusion that he did engage in certain illegal actions in what was described as various car-related businesses like car washes. Persistent lying or deceit to exploit others. This is mentioned in the Serbsky report, that he was extremely manipulative. Being callous, cynical, and disrespectful. Well, that's obvious coming from multiple witnesses. Repeatedly violating the rights of others through intimidation and dishonesty. The fact that he was very authoritarian and tyrannical in the home and toward random individuals that he encountered if he experienced what he thought was disobedience is also in the mental health assessment. Hostility, significant irritability, agitation, aggression, or violence. Multiple witness statements regarding this, as well as the report itself. Lack of empathy for others and lack of remorse about harming others, etc. You're welcome to look at this website, the Mayo Clinic, or Psychology Today. But as you could see, there are reasons why he was diagnosed in the Russian context as having mixed personality disorders. So another aspect of Mikhail's personality pathology as described by the Serbsky Center is something that I haven't seen mentioned, and that is what I brought up earlier in this video, the fact that the girl's mother in a lot of media coverage is not referred to as his wife, she is referred to as his common-law wife. Now, she had mentioned in her interviews that they were married in a church. But if in the legal context she is indeed a common-law wife, that is important because unlike certain countries, Russia does not have laws that would essentially make common-law spouses legally equivalent in terms of their rights to legal spouses. So it's a pretty telling sign that here is a man who claims to be very religious, who marries within the church and who is active within the church, but he never bothers to legally marry his essentially his wife, with whom he ended up living for 20 years prior to essentially kicking her out with threats of death and, according to her, the usage of weapons. So that I saw as a pretty obvious form of control in terms of her not really having the financial rights, let's say in a separation scenario, or like such as alimony. She probably would have been getting child support if the children were still underage. So that was a very interesting, clear sign of financial control of a woman whom he married in a church when she was very, very young. And she essentially, from what I understand, was a housewife. So she was not only, in my understanding, in a long-term abusive marriage, which I would argue was trauma bonded, but she was also very much financially dependent. Another interesting aspect to this, of course, is the girl's mental health and personality. From what I understand of the reports, they were diagnosed with severe PTSD, which, again, in my understanding, is linked to particular instances of abuse. And they're also diagnosed with what was described as like a victim syndrome. So this is not a type of verbiage, I'm once again looking at my notes, that is used in North America, but there is a new term which, according to the web, is now accepted, and that is child abuse syndrome. So it sounds like it's something along those lines. I would also make the case that the girls also have complex post-traumatic stress response from the entire situation, as opposed to the punctuation of PTSD of the most horrific things that have happened to them. One of the most important aspects of the defense argument in this case is the fact that what the girls had done was in fact self-defense, and that they were in a situation where they saw no way out and they could have died otherwise. Now, there's a strong argument for the latter with the oldest sister, Christina. The reports in the media do not give the date, but she did have a suicide attempt where she swallowed too many pills. An ambulance was called, and supposedly there's all this corroborating evidence from the ambulance doctors and her treatment. And supposedly this incident occurred after one of the more horrific things done by her father to her. In addition to that, there's the pepper spraying incident in the context of her asthma attack. So in any of those cases, there are probably more that we don't know about in the reports, and the trial appears to be closed. So in any of those cases, you could make a strong argument that she could have made another suicide attempt and she would have succeeded. So there was that aspect of an acute threat to specifically Christina's life. Another thing that's important here is the fact that the girls really didn't see a way out. Their mother was removed from the situation, as was the maternal side of the family. The paternal side of the family seems to have accepted or didn't see a problem with what was going on as far as their father's behavior was concerned. The girls, as stated earlier, didn't think the teachers sufficiently intervened. Only the school counselor / psychologist kind of tried, but nothing came out of it. The neighbors were so used to the screaming, they just interpreted it as a maladaptive parenting technique, but they didn't really bother to do anything about it. The friends would receive text messages, but it didn't appear that the friends' parents were informed, or if they're informed, nothing really came out of that either. If the police reports by local citizens were filed, indeed, and we're not sure about that, nothing came out of that either. So the girls, as was stated, were essentially kept captive for about a year in this devilish apartment. And you really could make an argument that the younger ones were underage. They only had limited access to money, which was coming from their father, so there's significant financial control on top of everything else. No one was helping them. It's one of those, a lot of people knew bits and pieces of the situation, maybe not the whole situation, but no one really did enough to help them. So they did really perceive this as having no way out unless they got rid of the abuser, as awful and horrifying as that sounds. In fact, patricide, the killing of a father, comprises a small percentage of murders, and frequently it is linked to some kind of long-term pervasive abuse of the children in the family. As far as I found, there appear to be no mental health assessments of the mother in the media. I think it's safe to assume that she too was a target of abuse for decades. She was in a financially controlled situation, physically violent situation. It started, according to her, when she was pregnant with the first child, so she too probably saw limited ways out, and when she was forcibly removed from the home, it doesn't look like she sought proper mental health. As I said, my personal interpretation of just the way she looked in all these media appearances, she looked like a destroyed, defeated person that really is in need of a seriously good mental health professional and his or her help over the long term. And the fact that Aurelia, the girl's mother, and the oldest son, as the only male other than the father in the situation, were removed from the home around 2015, to me screams classic isolation. So when the father decided to step it up with his abuse to the next level, he isolated the girls even further, to the point where there really, in their opinion, was no way out. So as I've said at the beginning, this case is ongoing. It's taking place as far as the trial of the youngest sister Maria behind closed doors. I believe the trial of the two older girls, Christina and Angelina, will be held in a similar format, but I'm sure we will see media reports, and my personal opinion is that the girls' self-defense argument in the case of the two older girls, where they were found to be mentally sound by the mental health evaluators, where the self-defense argument really triumphs because what they had endured over the years is really hard to imagine in general, but it's impossible to imagine when it's coming from what should be one of the closest family members, their father. So I hope you enjoyed this new sub-direction of this channel. I'll continue doing the other videos as well. Please leave some comments down below, questions, concerns, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.